Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my 2023 Spring Split LCK Power Rankings video. I'm super excited to be making this, to be pumping this out. I have been steadily getting back to content after the off-season break. Thank you guys for waiting, by the way. I know off-season content was a little bit sparse, but we're getting back into the swing of things, and we've really already started. The LPL has already kicked off. If you have not watched my pre-season power rankings video for the LPL, that's going to be linked up in the iCard right now. I highly recommend you check that out, obviously after you watch this one, but I'm going to be going over all of the teams just like I did in that video, except this time instead of 17, it is 10 teams here in the LCK, the reigning world champion region LCK. Very, very, very excited to do this. A lot of shakeups in the LCK this offseason. You usually don't see a lot of top players leaving teams like they did this offseason in the LCK. So a lot of really interesting things to talk about. If you guys are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. I'm going to be saying a lot of opinions that are going to maybe not make people mad, but certainly disagree with some of the populace that is going to be watching this video. So if you do enjoy it, I hate asking this at the beginning of videos, but if you find yourself enjoying this throughout, go ahead and throw it a like. It really does help a lot. We put a lot of effort into these power ranking videos, especially. These are some of my favorite videos to make all year long. So if you are enjoying them, let me know down in the comment section below. And of course, let me know your power rankings. What teams do you think I have too high? What teams do you think I have too low? But with all that out of the way, it is time to jump into the video. If you're not familiar with the power rankings series that I have on my channel and how I go about these videos, we're going to be going through all 10 teams from number 10 in my power rankings all the way up to number 1 in my power rankings. I'm going to be going through the lineup, talking about what I like, what I don't like, why I think they're in the spot that they are, what their upside and you know, their floor and their ceiling could potentially be, all that stuff. So buckle in. These are usually pretty long videos, but they are very informative and they're very fun to make. So let's go ahead and kick it off here with number 10 in my power rankings. And I've seen a lot of kind of debate towards the bottom of the LCK standings, at least from LCK fans. But for me, it was a pretty easy choice to see who was coming in here at number 10. And that means coming in at last place to kick off the spring split here in 2023, it is going to be the Kwangdong Freaks. This is a pretty easy decision for me. KDF coming in here at number 10. They really, really did go for a rebuild approach. I'm just not exactly sure I fully believe in a lot of the talent that they ended up going with. So their roster in 2023 is looking like Dudu in the top lane, Youngjae in the jungle, Bulldog in the mid lane, Taiyun in the AD carry position, and June at support. As per usual, if I'm saying a player's name wrong, especially one that hasn't been in the league very often, please let me know down in the comment section below, but please do it in a respectful way. I try to get through as many games as I possibly can. As you guys know, I cover a lot of regions, and I have to watch a lot of tapes, so sometimes I'm watching at 2 times speed with no audio, so I don't exactly know how everyone's name is pronounced. I'm happy to get it right if you tell me what it is in the comments, but don't call me a moron just for not knowing it. I apologize, but we move on here with the Kwangdong Freaks. Let's talk about where the outlook for this team is. I don't actually really like what this team did in the offseason. Obviously, they blew up. I mean, that's pretty apparent. They brought in 4 relative rookies. Some of them have, you know, LCK experience, but not really a ton of LCK experience. Outside of Dudu, you really have nothing here in terms of, like, concrete LCK time, and that worries me. There is another team in the league that actually has that, but I kind of like the players that they brought in a little bit more. For KDF, I'm really not super sold on the players individually, so let's go ahead and talk about each of these players going down the line. As you can see on the screen, obviously you've got all 5 players up and then a number below them. That is personally where I power rank them in their positions. So for Dudu, I have him as the 8th best top laner in the LCK. For everybody else, I have them as the 10th best player in their position. Obviously, it's a little bit flexible. The difference usually between like 8 and 10 isn't that big, you know, et cetera, et cetera. The difference between 4 and 6 usually isn't that big. And also, some positions are just more stacked than others. You can be a pretty good player at the mid lane position and still rank fairly low just because mid lane is quite stacked in the LCK. And so, overall, a lot of factors go into that. Just figured worth noting. If you get mad at a number or a player at a number, let me know who they should be above rather than why it's so crazy that they're at the spot that they're at. But let's go ahead and talk about KDF. Let's start in the top lane with Dudu. He's really the only player who played a significant amount last year, I should say. He played for Hanwha, a team that was really falling apart, and honestly, he looked kind of okay. He was probably the best player on that Hanwha Life team for a majority of 2022, which is kind of crazy to say. He really didn't look like a player that was going to be breaking out. I had very low expectations of him going into the season, and he did surpass that. So it is an okay pickup here, I would say, for Kwangdong. I'm not going to, tear this pickup to shreds by any means, but he's not the most exciting player in the world. I feel like 8 sitting here for Dudu is probably one of the better outcomes that you're probably going to get from him. He has consistently been like a bottom 3-ish top laner for the entirety of his career, maybe with the exception of parts of last year, but even then, still, it wasn't like he was dominating players. He just wasn't as atrociously bad as he had been in the past, and so some ups and downs for Dudu, but if he's your veteran presence, I'm really not all that stoked about that. You're bringing in Youngjae in the jungle, who I actually do really like. He's probably the player who's shown the most flashes of anybody on this team. He got some time filling in for Gen G, COVID or subs or something last year. I don't remember. I covered the game, but I don't remember. He got some time in the LCK. Watch that game back. He was actually kind of impressive. I really do like his map movements. He didn't really play a lot last year because he wasn't playing in the Challengers League, and so really didn't get to see a lot of tape from him in recent memory, but from what I've seen from him at least a couple of years ago, he is a pretty decent player and probably the one with the most upside of anybody on this roster. The player who played the most last year, I would say, is probably Bulldog here in the mid lane. He's the only young player that's kind of being promoted from Challengers here to actually come through the Kwangdong Freak system. He played for KDF Challengers last year, and that team was kind of meh. They were not very good in the Challenger system, but Bulldog was probably the best player on that team from what I saw, so I understand them wanting to bring him up. The problem is you're running into a lot of really good mid laners here in the LCK, and so Bulldog's really going to have to up his game in order to become anything that isn't just kind of disappointing here. He's not really what you want to see out of a team that really needs, like, a star. I don't think he really has the potential to turn into something more than, like, a lower tier mid laner in the region. Now, obviously, I could be wrong. What I saw from him wasn't explosive, and he didn't really have a lot of the teammates around him to be able to push him forward. Obviously, in a mid lane position, that can be relatively important if you play on a bad team. You might just look like a bad player even when you're not, but Bulldog certainly wasn't making his team better, even if he did look relatively okay. I think a lot of the success of this team is going to depend on this top side of Dudu, Youngjae, and Bulldog. I really think if Youngjae can, like, control the pace of the game against some of these worst teams, perhaps get Dudu an advantage that he did really well with in teamfights late in the games last year, and then perhaps Bulldog can, push forward a little bit more now that he has some more talented teammates around him. Maybe gives him some freedom to not carry games so much so, but, shove and roam, as I always talk about on this channel. I think that's going to be a really successful playstyle for KDF. We'll see if they go to that, because it'll be interesting to see if they want to play around Youngjae, or if they want to play around this bot lane of Taiyun and Jun here, who are both coming over from DRX. Now, it is worth noting Taiyun did not play for DRX Challengers for most of last year. Jun did, however. He played for most of last year, and he played in the playoffs, and so I got to see a little bit more of him. Taiyun was more of a substitute for DRX in particular, not so much a Challengers player, which is kind of a distinction in Korea that I don't think a lot of other regions have, but from what I've seen of these two, not only when they're playing together, but when they're playing separately, they're okay. Taiyun definitely has some positioning mistakes that he runs into every once in a while, can get a little bit over-aggressive. Usually on this channel, I hype up AD carries that do like to take risks, try to take some chances to make some big plays, but for Taiyun in particular, a lot of times it's just him mispositioning. It's not necessarily him being super aggressive. I think that's something he can clean up, but he's definitely going to have to show that at an LCK level. And then for Jun, I actually quite like his macro sense, but his laning stats weren't particularly great over the course of his Challengers time. I'm not sure if that's just because he had a bad AD carry or whatnot, but especially in the playoffs, it really became a problem for that DRX Challengers team. And so if Taiyun and Jun can get on the right page, perhaps they could be able to push forward, but for the most part, if I'm looking at a young player on KDF that's going to really set the tempo and kind of create a lot of the advantages that the team is going to have, it's probably going to be Youngjae in the jungle, and if not him, you're really relying on Dudu to be able to do a lot in the late game on these, more aggressive top laners that we're seeing be in meta right now. The Camille, the Fiora, the Cassante, whatever, right? Like, whatever you want to end up pulling out. It might be a lot on this top side to be able to create that, because I really don't have a lot of faith in this bot lane, and mid lane is certainly a question mark for me as well. So overall, it was a pretty easy choice for KDF to come in at number 10 here. I didn't really actually have to think about it too much. They are pretty clearly, in my opinion, the worst team in the LCK. Now, obviously, these players could have some upside that I'm just not seeing, but for now, they're going to come in last place, and I would be pretty surprised if they ended up pulling out a miracle season and making playoffs, just because I really don't know if this team has the upside that they might be looking for with an all-rookie roster. Moving on now to number 9 in my power rankings. We take a little bit of a tier jump here already, as you can see on the screen. Next to my 10th in the power ranking, it shows you an F tier. I do believe that the Guangdong Freaks are by themselves in F tier, so we're taking a jump up to D tier here for number 9 in the power rankings for me, because I do think that there is a little bit of the gap between the bottom 2 teams here. And coming in at number 9, probably to no surprise of a lot of people, it is going to be Breon. This is a roster that was kind of problematic last year, and I think they almost only downgraded across the board here, so don't really love the offseason they had, but let's go ahead and talk about what they're looking like. It's looking like Morgan in the top lane, Raptor, I believe, in the jungle, Karis in the mid lane, Henna at 80 carry, and Effort at support. Let's go ahead position by position and talk about this. First and foremost, I should talk about a potential 6-man on this roster. Raptor is listed as the starting jungler, I believe, right now, but it did recently come out that they re-signed Umti, who was their starting jungler last year. He didn't get a job elsewhere. I think it was rumored that he was going to Brazil and that he wasn't able to end up getting that, so he re-signs here with Breon. He could potentially come in here. I don't think it changes the outlook of this team really at all, and honestly, I think Raptor is probably a higher upside player to play here for Breon, and so I'm going to talk as if Raptor is the starter, but just know that I know Umti is on the team. It just doesn't seem like he is going to be the starting jungler, at least at the beginning of the season for Breon. But let's go ahead and talk about the roster here, starting with Morgan in the top lane. Lord Morgan returns here to Breon, had a quote-unquote breakout season, kind of a bounce back? I don't know. He never really had a good year before it, but a breakout in the sense of Morgan was really looked at as this bottom tier LCK top laner after his time on Hanwha Life, where he was really carried on a team with players like Chovy, like Deft, that had so much talent. He definitely got the short end of the stick, having to kind of bear the brunt of a lot of the criticism on that team. He gets looked at very poorly. He comes over here to Breon and actually looks kind of okay for most of last year. Very similar to Dudu. In fact, I compared those two players a lot over the course of 2022. I think Morgan is probably in for a little bit more regression than a player like Dudu is, who I just don't think is quite at... Morgan's not quite as consistent. Like, he did have his good games last split, but he still also had some bad ones, and I'm just not sure that he's ever really going to be like a top 7 or top 6 top laner in the LCK, but he is better than I think I gave him credit for going into 2022, and so there's something there. I understand bringing him back because he definitely is a fan favorite and he's going to attract players or viewers to your game, but I still don't think he's going to be some sort of like takeover threat. Like, you're not going to be able to dominate through topside, at least consistently. He can definitely win games, but it's never going to be on a consistent radar. Then you've got the jungle position here. Like I said, I'm going to pretend like it's Raptor, because as far as I'm aware, Raptor is the starting jungler for Breon as of right now. I actually quite like Raptor. He's had a couple of stints in the LCK for this Breon team when they're kind of just swapping players in and out, and he's looked kind of okay. He's looked a lot better than I think Umti has over the course of his career. Umti's kind of a player that I've never really been all that high on. He's played a long time in the LCK, and he's never really shown anything other than just being like a lower tier LCK jungler. I think taking a punt on a player like Raptor, especially when you have, I don't want to say known quantities in, some other positions, but players that I think we know aren't going to be like super top tier in a lot of the other positions, taking a punt on a player like Raptor, who could potentially come in and be a really solid jungler for this team, I think is definitely the right move. He didn't really play all that much last year, as per usual. Kind of came in and out of the Breon Challengers team, the fretted Breon at the time. Obviously, they're not fretted anymore, but kind of came in and out of that Challengers lineup. But with the tape that we do have, not only of him in Challengers League, but also in the LCK itself for this Breon team, he looks pretty good. He's certainly not someone that I would complain about bringing in and giving an opportunity. I certainly like him more than I liked a lot of the KDF players that we just talked about in the previous entry. But moving on to Karis here in the mid lane, obviously had a little bit of a stint here with Hanwha Life last year. Wasn't particularly high on him. I actually wasn't super high on him coming out of the Challengers League the year before. Played for Gen G Challengers, was a kind of a big deal, was kind of a big free agent acquisition for that Hanwha Life team. People really thought he was going to be a focal point for that team. He ended up really not working out, at least in year one. Mid lane's such a tough position to be able to translate to a higher level in at an LCK level, because you have to play the best in the world basically all the time. There are very few teams in the LCK that don't have a world-class mid laner, and so it's very difficult to get your bearings straight at that position unless you're like a superstar, and I just don't think Karis is that. He's on his second team now in 2 years at the LCK level. You'd never really love to see that, but hopefully him and Raptor can develop a little bit of a chemistry one thing that was really a problem for Karis last year is he had maybe the worst jungler in the league with On Fleek for a majority of 2022, and so if he can get some more stability in that position, we all know how important it is for a mid laner to have a jungler that they can play off of, to have a jungler that they can move around with, especially in last year's meta where it was very shove and roam, help the other lanes oriented. Karis just never really had a chance when his jungler was running it down. So perhaps with a little bit more stability in that position that maybe Raptor can offer you, that could be a positive for Karis in the long run. And then you've got the bot lane here of Henna and Effort. Now, before we jump into Effort, because I'm sure anybody who's followed this channel for any amount of time knows I certainly have some thoughts on Effort being on this team. Let's talk about Henna. Henna comes in at number 7. He's the highest rated player on this team. I think that has more to say about the depth of the LCK bot laners than it does about Henna. I think Henna's okay, but I think he's right around the same level as players like Morgan and Karis in terms of skill. I just think there are a lot of unproven bot laners coming into the LCK this year, and so he just kind of ends up ranking a little bit higher than a lot of the other ones. We'll get to them later, but he's okay. I think he was definitely the better part of his duo, which is kind of crazy considering one of them just went to a super big team in Gen G. Delight going to Gen G to be the support. Henna's sticking around here on Brion, though. Hopefully he can have a little bit of a better year. I'm not super expecting it because I think he definitely downgraded in the support position, but he's always had mechanics. He's just never really been a good laner. He's been a decent team fighter. If he's able to get through the laning phase and he's able to get to that secondary part of the game where he can play something like Aphelios and just take over in the late game with protection, he is pretty good at that hyper carry, like late game play style. He's just not very good at much else at the LCK level, and so definitely needs to develop a lot more than that, but you could do worse than Henna, as you can probably guess from the number 7 ranking. And then you bring in Effort to play support. Now, I really don't understand this. I think you can make a really solid case that Effort was just the worst player in the LCK last year by, like, a considerable margin. He was actively costing his team win after win after win after win, so much so that the team actively had to go out and sign a player in the middle of the season in Soulflower, Nongshim this is, in order to replace him because they just simply couldn't play him anymore to the end of the season. He was really, really bad. Now, Effort's a player that has succeeded in the LCK before, but, I mean, if recency bias is to be believed, Effort simply just should not have an LCK spot. He's got a lot, and I mean a lot, to prove over the course of 2023. If him and Henna get off to a rocky start in this bot lane for Brion, which I'm not saying won't happen, I'm certainly not saying it's out of the realm of possibility for that to happen, I think Effort could be a pretty big, candidate for being replaced pretty early on. I would imagine he's got to be on some level of a short leash. The only reason he doesn't come in at number 10 is because we just talked about KDF and June is barely played, and at least Effort has had some level of success in the LCK in the past. If he can come in and be like, at least like, I don't know, 80% of what he was in 2020 or 2019, then I think he's going to be at least an okay player for this team. But you didn't get that last year. You got like 4% of best version of Effort. I mean, he was really, really atrocious. And so you're really hoping that he can turn the corner over the course of 2023. But overall for Brion, while there is a little bit more upside in my opinion, and a little bit more floor than what KDF is offering you, it's not by a ridiculous amount to the point where I think this team is really going to be contending for a playoff spot. I think players like Morgan, Karis, and Henna have really kind of, I don't want to say shown us who they are, but I would be really surprised if they took like this big turn and suddenly became top 6-ish players in their roles. I just don't think that is going to happen. A player like Raptor really could kind of be the one that emerges, and perhaps Karis by de facto kind of plays off of that a bit better, but that's really what you're going to have to hope for on the side of Brion, because outside of that, I really don't think that you have a ton of upside on this team to be able to make playoffs. I just think that the floor of this team is perhaps a bit higher than a team like KDF, so lucky for them, they do not come in at number 10, they do just come in at number 9. That's going to bring us to our number 8 team now in the power rankings, and just like we jumped up a tier last time, we're actually going to jump up another one here. I know these tiers are getting a little bit small, but in the 10-team league, it kind of is important to define where I think these teams realistically can move up and down, and this is going to be the beginning of like the C tier, and what I define the C tier as, at least in the LPL video, is teams that could make playoffs, but realistically probably aren't expecting to make playoffs. Teams that would really try and could really push for it, but are likely going to be upsets if they do end up making it. And that's going to start here with number 8 as we kick it off with another really interesting roster here in Nongshim Red Force. Coming in at number 8, a lot of people are going to put this team a lot lower than 8th. Maybe not a lot. There's not a lot of spaces below 8, but I actually quite like the makeup of this team. I really like the fact that they've all played together for quite a while. And I like the fact that they just recently won Challengers League in Korea. That's a very, very big win to be moving on to the pros with 4 of the 5 members of that team hoisting that trophy. So their lineup for 2023 is looking like Din Din in the top lane. I believe that's how you say it. Please tell me if otherwise. I can't find it anywhere. Sylvie in the jungle, Fiesta in the mid lane, Vital at AD carry, and Peter at support. I really, really do like the idea behind bringing this roster up. Obviously, like I just said, Nongshim Red Force did just win Challengers Korea in summer of 2022 with 4 of the 5 members here. The only one that wasn't on that team, quote-unquote, was Vital, but he was on Nongshim. He probably has been practicing with a lot of these players, playing with them for about a year. He just wasn't playing in Challengers Korea like we talked about. Sometimes players are just substitutes for the main roster and not so much actual Challengers Korea players, but really, really interesting composition. So let's get into it individually, player by player, although I think it's more interesting to talk about this team as a whole. Each of these individual players do have a little bit of interesting tidbits about them. Starting with Din Din in the top lane, I'm actually not super into him. I think he would probably be the weak link on this team for the most part. I think top lane in general really isn't that strong at an LCK level, so hopefully you're able to hide him, but he was only fine. He was mostly weak side for them in Challengers Korea from what I watched, not only in the regular season, but throughout their playoff run. He's probably going to be that in the LCK as well. Not really someone who I expect to be given a lot of resources. However, it is kind of a carry-oriented top lane meta, or at least that's what we've seen so far. Like I said earlier, a lot of Fiora, a lot of Camille, things like that, a lot of Cassante that we're seeing come out kind of as the tank, quote-unquote, of the meta right now, and so not a lot of big, like, weak side champs that you would consider, so they might have to adapt to that a bit. He has shown an ability to play some of these more bruiser, fightery type of champions, but oftentimes he still is relatively passive in laning phase and just tries to get to those late game team fights or those split pushing scenarios where he can become a pretty big menace. I still think he's a pretty decent player, just not someone who I would expect to be like the hyper carry of the team by any stretch. I think top lane, for the most part, is kind of a weak role, though, so like I said, he might be able to do some surprising things over the course of the split. Where I start to get excited about this team, at least in terms of upside, is going to be the mid-jungle duo here, starting with Sylvie in the jungle. I actually really like Sylvie. Of course, pretty much everybody on this team has gotten at least a little bit of time in the LCK because Namshing was a disaster last year, but also just because I think a lot of teams, test out some of these players over the course of the year. Sylvie was definitely one of them. He got some time in the LCK, and he actually looked pretty okay. I'm pretty high on him. I think he's going to come in and be a relatively good jungler, basically from moment one, and I think he's got, like, top 4, top 5 jungle and LCK potential. If he can hit that over the course of the year, I'm going to look pretty good for putting this team at 8th instead of 9th or 10th. Potentially, like, he could carry this team a lot higher. I actually really, really do like his upside as a player, and you pair him with a mid laner that he really worked super well with over the course of last year in Fiesta. I actually really like these two as a package duo. Both of them are incredibly mechanically talented, and both have pretty good decision-making, especially when together. They played off of each other incredibly well towards the back end of the year. It felt like they got better and better as the year went on in Challengers Korea, and we kind of saw that culminate in a championship trophy victory for that Nongshim team. And so to bring them up together, I think that's going to be the biggest W of the offseason for Nongshim. I think they could secretly, like, potentially by the end of the year, maybe be like a top 6, top 5 mid-jungle duo in the league if everything goes right. They really do have that kind of talent in them, and the 7-8 ranking might feel a little bit low for me to say that, but that's kind of their floor. Like I said in my LPL Power Rankings video, when I rank a lot of these players in terms of their position, I'm ranking usually their floor. Like, Sylvie could be the 4th or 5th best jungler in the league by the end of the year. I wouldn't be all that surprised. Fiesta could move up to, 5 or 6 if everything goes right, and I wouldn't be all that surprised. But for now, it's just really hard to give them that designation without ever really having them seen, any action in the LCK at any extended period of time. So for now, they come in at 7 and 8, but really a duo that has the potential to break through and really be a huge point of power, I would say, for Nongshim over the course of the year. Then you've got the bot lane where I'm not going to say I get a little bit more concerned, because I definitely don't with the support. But in the bot lane, you've got Vital. Vital's the one piece of the team that is a lot harder to judge, just because, again, he didn't play with a lot of these players over the course of last year, and so it's definitely more interesting to kind of get a gauge of what he is capable of. In the recent times, he has played again for Nongshim on the main roster, as pretty much everybody has on this team, in bits and pieces over the course of last year, but really didn't show anything ridiculously special. He's going to come in at number 9. If I had to guess, I would say he's probably going to be the weak link of the team. Him and Din Din, I think, are probably the 2 weakest players. I think the rest of the 3 are actually pretty strong. Top lane and bot lane, though, are roles that you can relatively hide when it comes to optimal League of Legends gameplay, especially if your jungle, mid, and support are really doing well. And so let's say Vital is a little bit of a weak link for this team. hopefully it's not going to be too much of an issue for Nongshim, but I wouldn't expect him to be this power point of the map. I don't expect this team to play through him. But where I do expect this team to play through is Peter, baby. I get to talk about him on this channel once again. Peter is a channel darling. If you watched any of the reviews of the LCK from last year, you'll know I'm very, very high on Peter. I think at points in time last year, he was a top 4-ish support in the LCK over the spring split, and then he just lost his job and never got it back. Effort was so bad, and yet they felt like they had to sign Snowflower instead of actually promoting Peter. Instead, he finally gets another chance here in the LCK here with basically this entire roster. Peter might as well be my channel mascot at this point with how much I hype him up. Hopefully he can come true on that. I have him as the number 7 ranked support. He could be higher than that. He was really good last year when he got to play with Ghost. I don't know if it's going to be the same with Vital. They're very different playstyles, although Vital might kind of morph into a role very similar to what Ghost was offering this team last year. But Peter is a very, very good support. He's very good at the engaged champions, but he really showed a propensity for the enchanters as well. I think he's very versatile. He can play for lane. He can play to roam. I actually really do like him as a player a lot. It's not just a bit on this channel. I think Peter is actually a very, very good support, and I would not be surprised at all if he had a pseudo breakout year, very similar to a player like Kale last year on Liv's Sandbox had, where it just kind of felt like, oh, I guess we're seeing the birth of another really good support in the LCK. I would not be surprised at all if Peter was a huge, huge point of success if he was able to pair up with Sylvie super well, roam around the map, perhaps get Fiesta super far ahead, or if they do want to play for bot lane, if I'm wrong and Vital does want to be kind of a main focal point, kind of a hyper carry in that bottom lane, you can bring Sylvie down to the bot lane, perhaps bring Fiesta as well, and get Vital ahead. I think Peter is very versatile in the fact that he can really get anybody on the team moving if they dedicate resources to them. So overall, I actually really do like the construction of this Nongshim team. I think most people are going to look at it and say, oh, you know, 5 quote-unquote rookies, and, you know, what are they really going to accomplish? It's really hard to gain consistency with that, but I think if any group of rookies is prepared to do that in the LCK, it's probably going to be this Nongshim team. I'm much higher on them. Again, if they were to end up making playoffs, well, I'm certainly not going to predict it. That's why I have them at 8th instead of 6th, you know, but if they were to end up making playoffs, I wouldn't be the most surprised person on the planet. I think there are teams that I would definitely expect to be out of playoffs quicker than them, the 2 below them. And so for Nongshim, I think a successful year would be some development from your jungle mid, perhaps Peter breaking out, and then whatever you can get out of top and ADC is probably going to be an advantage. If this doesn't work, that's also fine. You have summer to potentially bring in some big names. There are a lot of big names still on the free agent market for you to try and reach out and see if you can bring in. So I really do like the idea of kind of experimenting with a roster that very much did work on its own in the Challengers Korea League and seeing if you can bring it up to the LCK. It's a gamble. Not a lot of these kinds of teams pay off, but when they do, they usually pay off big. That's going to go ahead and bring us to our 7th team here in the power rankings and our final projected non-playoff team here in the spring split of 2023. Definitely a little bit of an easy choice. I really do think that the bottom 4 are a little bit separate from the top 6, who I think all have relatively interesting pieces, but coming into the top of kind of this lower bracket, the top of the C tier, coming in 7th place, it is going to be Liv Sandbox. This is a team that was very close to making Worlds last year. They finished 5th, obviously, overall after they weren't able to get it done in the regional gauntlet, but they finished 4th in the... Actually, I think they finished 3rd in the regular season. Went on a pretty decent playoff run. Were able to beat DRX in the playoffs, but unfortunately, they weren't able to get it done against DRX in the gauntlet, so they just missed out on Worlds, and unfortunately, they do lose quite a bit of the talent that ended up getting them to Worlds in the first place, most notably their jungle and their ADC, who I think are both very solid players. So let's go ahead and go over what their 2023 roster is looking like. It's looking like Bertle in the top lane, Willer in the jungle, Closer in the mid lane, Envy at AD carry, and Kale at support. Probably the team with the most good / bad of anybody in the league. This is probably the most divisive up and down roster, which is why they come in kind of low for me at 7. I don't really see a world in which they can be higher than that. But they do have some talent on here that I do like, and I'm actually going to start off with that in the top lane. Bertle, I actually do like. I like the pickup of Bertle. Was never really given a fair shake, was kind of thrown into a Damwon team that really needed to win basically immediately, and it's really tough to get a player to develop, especially a player who's very aggressive and has such a carry-oriented style like Bertle on a team like that with expectations immediately. And so for him to go to a team here where maybe he can get a bit more of the resources, he doesn't have these superstar players like Canyon and Showmaker around him to kind of facilitate him to play a more supportive, passive, low-resource style. I think that might be good for him and his development overall. I have him at number 7, but talent-wise, he definitely could be higher than that. I do like him as a player, and this is the meta. I've been talking about it all video for him to shine. A lot of split pushers, a lot of carry tops that I think Bertle could pull out, and potentially this team could play a lot more topside and be really positive and successful in doing so. So, kicking off this team, I really do like the addition of Bertle. In my opinion, it is the best addition of the 3 that they made this offseason. But it's not a super high bar to jump because the other major addition, the other proven, I guess, addition that you've brought into the roster here is going to be Willer in the jungle. Now, replacing Krako is never going to be easy. I think Krako is pretty unanimously underrated at this point. He is an incredibly solid jungler, one of the best in the region, in my opinion. He did a really good job last year of playing for bot lane, a bot lane that was constantly winning, and a bot lane that could win games in the late game. He did a great job of making sure the enemy jungler never was able to get pressure on that side and was able to kind of push forward his team, allow his team to be able to win games for them. You go from a player like Krako to a player like Willer. Now, yes, Willer has definitely shown flashes in the past of being an interesting player. He did go to Worlds in 2021 on that Hanwha Life team. A lot of people forget he was the starting jungler for their entire Worlds run, but last year was definitely not a year that would be remembered by a lot of Willer fans. It definitely wasn't inspiring for Willer fans because he was still on that Hanwha team and he was benched for On Fleek for basically the whole season, who was one of the worst players in the league. And if you can't get in over On Fleek last year, that's definitely an indictment. I'm not sure if that's just Hanwha wanting to stick with the player they chose to start. Maybe there was something in scrims or whatever, but it's never really a good look when the player in front of you is doing really horrible and your team still won't let you get into games, especially when you have the kind of upside that Willer has. And so hopefully 2022 was an anomaly. Hopefully Hanwha Life was just wrong about Willer. That's kind of what you're hoping for if you're a Live Sandbox fan, because he has shown interesting pieces in the past. I actually thought he was okay on the Worlds run with Hanwha a couple of years ago, and so if he can just kind of be an okay jungler, I think overall that's going to be positive for Sandbox. It's just not something that I'm going to go into the season with expectations of. I think he's probably going to be, at least at the start of the year, a little bit of a weak link, and he might have to grow back into being a little bit more of a facilitator for LSB overall. Then you have Closer returning here in the mid lane. I've always been a little bit lower on Closer than the general consensus, I would say by quite a bit. He is very similar to some of the other players that we're going to talk about throughout the world. I think each region has at least one player that's like the assassin mid lane player, whether it's Cream in the LPL, whether it's Certus in the LEC. I feel like most regions have a player like Closer that's just like, he wants to play Akali, he wants to play LeBlanc, he wants to play things like that that are able to kind of affect the game in a grander sense, pick a target and blow him up. It's not exactly the most meta thing in the world right now, but Kassadin is really strong, so perhaps that could be pulled out by Closer. Either way, I'm just not super huge on his versatility, where I like a player like Cream in the LPL for being a really good assassin player, like a top 3 or 4 mid laner in the region when he's on his best champions, but yet still relatively relevant outside of that, like isn't a complete negative when he's not on the picks that he wants. I feel like Closer is, in fact, a pretty big negative on the picks that he doesn't want. We saw him on the Control Mages towards the middle to end portion of last year's split, where he was having to play the Talia a lot. He was having to play things like the Victor quite a bit because teams were punishing that, and he looked bad. He might be the worst Victor I've ever seen at a pro level. He just doesn't play champions like that at a pro level, really, in any facet. So he's got to grow a lot as a player. He made All-Pro last year in the LCK for voting, and I thought that was pretty ludicrous, pretty ridiculous, but I have him a lot lower. I have him coming as the 7th mid laner. He still definitely has talent, and the thing about him is he can carry games. If he does get champions that he can make more of a macro impact on, he's going to be able to do that relatively efficiently. The problem is just, I don't think he is going to be able to do that in most games, because if teams are smart enough to target him in draft, he really doesn't have the flexibility to be able to move out of that. I think we're going to see a little bit more of an exposed version of Closer this year, when he doesn't have a player like Krako that's going to be able to defend him all the time, and when his bot lane isn't going to be perma PowerPoint on the map. I think Closer might get a little bit more attention, not only from his team, but from the enemy team, and I think that could be a little bit of an issue. So I'm expecting a little bit of a down year from Closer in the mid lane. And then you've got the bot lane here of Envy and Kale. Now, Envy was the starter for Live Sandbox at the beginning of last year as well. This was the bot lane that they went into 2022 having, but he ended up getting benched for Prince, and that was the best thing that ever happened to Live Sandbox. Prince goes on to finish second in my MVP voting and in the actual league's MVP voting. He was phenomenal, but he goes over to North America to play for FlyQuest, so Envy joins back in on the roster here. Really didn't love what I saw from him last year, but he has the tools to be a decent AD carry at this level. I think his grade is boosted a little bit by the fact that I really do like Kale at support. For me, he was the LCK rookie of the split last year. I actually picked him over Vikla. I thought his impact on the game was a little bit higher. His laning with Prince was phenomenal. He did a great job of setting up his AD carry to be super successful. If he can do that a little bit for what Envy is this year, I think that could be really good as a secondary power point on the map for Live Sandbox. I always talk about wanting to have two lanes in the game that you can play for. I think top lane is going to be a lane that you can play for on the side of Sandbox. If bot lane can turn into that as well, I do think that would be more positive than putting a lot of pressure on someone like Closer to be that guy basically in every single game. So you're really hoping Envy can step up, get a lot closer to maybe what they were hoping they would bring in when they brought him in last year, but if he was like a bottom 2, bottom 1, even AD carry in the league, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. He really has not shown anything at an LCK level, even with a bit of time and a bit of chances. And then you've got Kale, like I said, at support. I really, really, really like Kale. It feels really bad to put him as low as 6th in the LCK support rankings, but I do think we see a little bit of regression from him this year just because I don't think his AD carry is nearly as strong. I think last year he was pretty easily a top 3, 4 support in the LCK, like a world caliber support. I do think he has that kind of upside, but I'm not exactly sure this is going to be the type of team that is going to bring it out of him. I think if he can unlock Envy and perhaps that bot lane could be a little bit stronger in the 2v2 than I am anticipating, that could be really, really solid for Live Sandbox. You could have a power point on the top side. Bertle is really good at winning 1v1 lane matchups, especially carry versus carry. If Willer can get back to form that he had in 2021, like going into that Worlds run, and perhaps Closer can just get a tad bit more consistent for my liking, like the Sandbox team could make some noise. There's a reason they are at the top of the C tier, the top of the non-playoff teams in my power rankings, above a team that I do like in Nongshim, and that's because I do think that the talent level on this team is relatively comparable, like upside-wise, but they have proven a lot more. I like Bertle, I like Willer, I like Kale. If you can get good performances out of some of the players that I think are a little bit more inconsistent, or players that maybe I don't have as high of expectations for, like I could see a world in which they become a playoff team. I'm just not going to bet on it because I do see Closer, Envy, even Willer to an extent as players that absolutely need to prove it on the Rift at an LCK level again with this team composition before I truly believe they are playoff caliber. But overall, not a great offseason for Live Sandbox. You really would have hoped that they would have been able to retain a bit more, but with the situation that they were given, with some of their players leaving, I guess theoretically you could have done worse. You do have players with nice upside here, and you were able to keep around Kale. So overall, 7th place, probably about round where everybody is going to put Sandbox, and I don't think I'm in too much disagreement there. That's going to go ahead and bring us now to our top 6. Remember, top 6 in the LCK make playoffs, so this is the start of my projected playoff teams, and like I said in the last ranking, I really do believe that top 6 are kind of in a category of their own. I think top 6 feel very defined in the LCK going into 2023, at least in terms of expectations, so it's really just about the order that you want to put everything in, and coming in at number 6 for me, coming in at the bottom, and in my opinion, pretty clearly below the rest, kind of in a tier of their own here, which is what they are in the B tier. Coming in at number 6, I have KT Rolster. Now, of course, longtime viewers of the channel know I have gained a reputation as a little bit of a KT doubter, which I really don't believe I've earned. I think I give them their props when they earn it, but oftentimes they play above their skill level at the beginning of the year and then start to regress back to the mean. That's kind of just been a little bit of a trend with this organization. I hope one day that they will kind of turn that around, but I think looking at this roster, while there are some fantastic pieces on this team that do make you excited, you are expecting a lot from some players that maybe didn't perform the way that you would have wanted them to in 2022. So their 2023 roster is looking like Keen in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane, aiming at AD carry, and Lehens at support. Let's go through it. I like to go through it. So let's start with Keen in the top lane. Keen, obviously one of the greatest top laners in LCK history. I really don't think it's all that arguable to make that statement. Long time, Freaks player, whether it's a Freak or last year on Guangdong, long time player for that organization. finally leaving an org that really never put the team around him that he deserved to go over here to KT Rolster. Unfortunately for him, it's probably coming off of his worst season as a pro in 2022. He was okay, and he certainly had his moments of very good play, but the inconsistency that he showed last year was really not something that he had shown at all throughout his career up until that point. It was really not great to see some of the games, especially in Summer Split, where he would get some of these carry versus carry matchups and just play way over aggressive. Perhaps it's because his team was really struggling towards the beginning of the season and he felt an onus on himself to try and win those games for KDF, but whatever the reason was, he was playing way too fast. His team was not there to back him up, and he was really costing his team a lot of advantages towards the back half of Summer Split. Now, we know Keen can be a top laner in this league. He has been for, I want to say, half a decade at this point, but it is going to be, quote-unquote, a little bit of a bounce back for him if he does do that. That's why I have him coming in at number 4. That is not where he was last year. He was a little bit lower than number 4 in terms of his production last year on the Rift, but he has the talent to be number 1 or number 2 in this league, and he was for a very long time. So if you can get a better version of Keen coming back here for KT Rolster, that's going to be good. If you can get a better version of Cuz coming back here, that's going to be good. He's one of the 2 returning members from KT last year, and it's interesting that they brought him back. He had, again, probably his worst year as a pro in 2022, and so you're really looking for him to bounce back. He was just bleeding out early games last year, which was definitely a problem. It felt like he never really went into games with a plan. He kind of just went in, started jungling, something would go wrong, and he would be on the back foot basically from moment one. KT was really a team that wanted to play through bot lane last year, and while they were able to accomplish that, while Cuz definitely had this idea of wanting to make sure that Aiming could get to these late games where he could be positive, the early games were pretty much always a problem for KT. That was never really up for debate, and Cuz was a big reason for that. And so, again, you're really hoping for a turnaround from him. He really has not been the same in the last few years. It felt like, he has kind of been on a slowly decline since like 2019, 2020. 2021 was a little bit worse, and then 2022 was kind of the peak of that decline. Hopefully that he can kind of turn that around for KT Rolster, but again, add that onto Keen. It's another player that really needs to kind of have a bounce back 2023 for me to feel confident that, he's going to be a top tier jungler in the region. He comes in at number 6, which I think is pretty respectable. The bottom, quote unquote tier of junglers really isn't all that strong in the LCK. You saw someone like Willer come in. Obviously players like Youngjae that we talked about or Sylvie that we've talked about really aren't all that experienced, and so Cuz definitely has the potential, or should be better than a lot of those players, but it's just hard to know because it is going to require him to play a little bit better than he did last year. And then to kind of cap off this triumvirate of players that kind of need a better 2023 than they had in 2022, you've got BDD in the mid lane, who played for the biggest disaster team in the league in Nongshim last year. Everybody on that team looked bad. It's hard to really point to one particular player and be like, you needed to play better, because they all needed to play better. But it is worth noting that BDD is also coming off of the worst year of his career in 2022. BDD, longtime mid laner for Gen G, gets, moved on so that they can go to Chovy, goes to Nongshim. Everybody has expectations for that team, and they completely fall apart. BDD now moves over to KT. He's got a much more stable, you would hope, team around him, but I would be lying if I said there weren't some concerns on this team that they might be a little bit more, closely resembling that Nongshim team of 2022 than they are, potentially like a DRX team that's kind of thrown together of 2022, and so you're really going to need BDD to turn that around. He really was not the same ever since he came back from COVID. I'm not going to say that that is like definite proof that, he is sick and he's not going to get better, because obviously, whatever. There's a lot of factors. I'm not even saying that that is the problem. I'm just saying that was kind of the time frame where he really started to, downswing. And if he's continuing on that downswing, this is going to be a problem. You're looking at this top side of Keen, Cuz, and BDD. If you're looking at that in 2019 or 2020, you're like, holy crap, we've got one of the best top sides in the world. No questions asked. But unfortunately, you're looking at it in 2023 where I think you really do start to raise a lot of question marks about how good that top side of the map can be. If you can get Cuz and BDD on the same page, they can really start to work together. That's going to be good if Keen can get back to being a really, really stable top laner where you can put him on carries and he's going to be able to win the 1v1 with no pressure. He's going to be able to take resources, or he can play the tanks at a high level. If you can get that version of Keen, add that on to potentially the best versions of BDD and Cuz that we've had, that could be an incredibly strong top side. The ceiling for this team is pretty high, but unfortunately the floor is honestly kind of low for this top side, so you're really hoping for a lot of bounce back from them. Where I do see at least a little bit of stability for this team, at least in terms of what they performed last year, is going to be the bot lane, but man, this is a punt on a bot lane. Like, this is really hoping that these two players mesh, because playstyle-wise, I really don't think that they do mesh really all that well. We'll start with Aiming, who had a breakout year last year. He had been someone who had shown flashes of being a really good AD carry in the past, both in the LCK and the LPL, but had never put together a season that was consistent. He's always been a fantastic team fighter, but his laning has always been a pretty big problem, and that was kind of exemplified last year when KT really took a lot of the onus off of him in the laning phase. You know, you had Life come in, who was a really protective-oriented support. He was going to make sure that Aiming could get to the late game, try to make plays elsewhere on the map, and then allow Aiming to do his thing in a lot of these late-game team fights. That is not the kind of style that Lehens is going to play, basically, at all. So you're hoping Aiming can hold on to some of that form he showed in 2022, where, like I said, in my opinion, it was the best year of his career up until that point. But if there was a regression back towards the mean of him just being kind of a mid-tier AD carry at an LCK level, I really wouldn't be all that surprised. I would more expect that, to be honest. I think last year is going to be looked at as a little bit of an outlier for Aiming, and I think he's going to regress a little bit back to the mean. But you do bring Lehens in at support here. Now, a lot of people are going to say Lehens is the best support in the world. I think he played like the best support in the world last year when he was on the best team, you know, in the world in the regular season, like in the regional play. Obviously, wasn't able to get it done at Worlds, but Lehens was really, really good last year on a team that really embraced his playstyle of playing super aggressive in the bot lane 2v2. Ruler is somebody who was always going to be able to follow up on stuff like that. And then Lehens is also very good at being able to roam, and Ruler is another kind of player that's going to be really good at playing safe in the lane. That was basically a match made in heaven for a bot lane duo. I'm not exactly sure this bot lane duo is going to hold up to that. Lehens has had problems in the past with players that are a little bit more passive in that bot lane role. Deft comes to mind, where it just didn't click because Deft didn't really want to play this super aggressive style in lane. Aiming, I'm a little bit worried about the same thing happening to him here, and so it'll be interesting to see if these two click. I think there is a little bit of regression in store for this bot lane, though. I really have only talked negatively about this team, but like I said, I still do think that talent-wise, they are a cut above everybody that we have talked about, you know, below this, all the four teams that we have talked about before KT Rolster. I think players like Keen, players like BDD are due to have better years than they did in 2022. It's basically inevitable. They really can't be as bad. Their talent level is just much higher than what they were able to show in 2022, but there are still concerns on this team, which is why I have them in their own, you know, quote-unquote B tier here at the bottom of the top six. I still think, like I said, there is a chance that they're able to, you know, make some kind of run in the playoffs, maybe make it to Worlds, but it's not really something I would expect. I think this is going to be a competitive team, but maybe not one that really competes for the top of the standings throughout the year. That's going to bring us to our number 5 team now in the power rankings. The top 5 are all really strong teams. These are all teams that I think can be competitive at a top level. I think some things are obviously going to have to go more right for numbers 5 and 4 than they are for the top 3. But it's still, you know, every team from this point onwards, I would consider an A-tier team internationally. All of these teams could potentially be strong threats at the World Championship if they were to make it. And needless to say, all 5 of them could make Worlds. So coming in at the bottom of that list, and at number 5 in my power rankings, it is going to be the reigning world champions, DRX. Now, that's pretty shocking, I think, to a lot of people who maybe have not kept up with a lot of the off-season changes, but this is not the World Championship DRX team that just won a couple of months ago. They have made a lot of changes. Only one member of that World's winning team has returned here for 2023. So their roster is looking like Rascal in the top lane, Kroko in the jungle, Fate in the mid lane, Dectum at AD carry, and Barrel at support. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Rascal in the top lane. Love this addition. Now, I talked a little bit earlier in the video about how Peter might be a little bit of a channel mascot for me here, especially for the LCK with how much I've hyped him up. Rascal is right up there with him. I think there were points last year in 2022, especially towards the beginning of spring, where I'm just like, is he the best top laner in the world? Like, it's definitely been a conversation that had to be asked. He is phenomenal as a player with resources. He's probably one of the best carry tops in the world, in my opinion. He comes in at number 2 in my top lane tier list, my top lane player rankings list, only behind, you know, spoiler alert, I don't think I'm shocking anybody by saying only behind Zeus. Rascal's a really, really, really good player. This, in my opinion, is a pretty big upgrade on the side of DRX. Kingen was good last year, but Kingen is just simply not Rascal. Kingen's a really good weak side player that, if given resources, can do stuff, but is mostly going to be more of a secondary piece for his team so long as the top lane meta allows him to be that. Rascal is not that. Rascal wants resources. Rascal wants to push forward. He wants to be a focal point for this team. And looking at the construction of the rest of this team, I actually think that he's in a pretty good position to be that guy for DRX, just like he was for KT Rolster in a lot of the spring split before they transitioned to more of a bot lane playstyle with aiming in summer. And so really do like this pickup of Rascal. I think he's a solid player, and I think you could really make a case that he is the best player on this DRX team. I think the other person that you can make the case for being the best player here is Krocko in the jungle, who I think is criminally underrated here on DRX. He was fantastic for Sandbox last year. That was a team that really did surprise everybody because, you know, everybody looked at Prince as like, oh, wow, he's absolutely carrying. And yes, Prince was fantastic. He was given a lot of the resources and he did fantastic with them. Kale was also really good in setting up a lot of those plays for Prince, and not only that, but making sure he stayed safe in the early game if things weren't going to go their way. But you have to give credit to Krocko. This is somebody who at the end of 2021, we were talking about him. He was Rookie of the Year. Don't forget that. He won that over Owner in the same position. Owner's a great player. Krocko is also a great player. He's one of the best junglers in the world, and I think he has continuously proven that even when he hasn't had the best of talent around him. I think this team is actually pretty conducive to him having a pretty good year here. Playing off of top lane is not really something he's ever done at a super high level, but he's the kind of player that I think he can adapt to playing like that. And so really do like bringing Krocko in here. Him and Rascal could be a very scary duo, and him and Fate could honestly be a really scary jungle mid duo as well. Fate definitely more of that shove and roam, more supportive style mid that is going to try and enable his jungler. Perhaps Krocko, instead of being that more supportive jungler that he kind of was last year, could be a little bit more of the carry that he was in 2021. Would really like to see that out of him. He definitely has the talent to do so. And so you're looking at the first two additions here of Rascal and Krocko. Yes, you're losing, you know, really solid players that just won you the World Championship, and players like Kingen, player like Pioshik, right? Who really did show a lot of progress over the course of the World Championships, but you're replacing them with solid players like Rascal and Krocko that I certainly don't think you can explicitly say are one-for-one downgrades, which is always good on the side of DRX. Where I start to get a little bit concerned is the mid lane. You're definitely changing playstyles here, going from Zeka to Fate, who, it's definitely a change. Zeka was a carry style mid laner. Showed that off at the World Championships, but definitely showed that off in the regular season as well. Hyped him up a lot on this channel. He's the other player in the LCK that I've really planted my flag in terms of what he is able to accomplish, and Fate coming in to replace him is definitely going to be a transition. Now, obviously, an entire team of new players, it's not like you have to sit here and be like, well, is he going to fill Zeka's spot? Well, he doesn't have to. He's not playing with the same players. But Fate can definitely be more of that facilitating type of mid. He had a little bit of a down year last year. Definitely showed moments on KDF of being like a decent player, but nothing that I would consider to be overtly fantastic. His pairing with Krocko, I think, is going to really show whether or not DRX can be a true contender or not. If he's able to get a lot of these more supportive picks in the mid lane, get Krocko super far ahead for him to be able to affect top, bot, you know, etc., wherever he needs to be, or just carry the game himself, I think that's going to be a really good strategy for DRX, but Fate is certainly not the kind of mid laner that you're going to want to play around in terms of power pressure. He's going to come in at number 6 in the mid lane rankings for me. He comes in just below like that tier of players that I think really could make like a top tier difference. I think he comes in right below BDD, who obviously had a bad year last year, but we know he can be like a top tier difference maker. I think Fate is kind of the best player in that clump of players that I find just okay. They're not really going to carry you to anything beyond like a decent year. You know, I think he comes in right above a player like Closer on Live Sandbox for me. Fate is a solid player, but not someone who is really going to take over games. Hopefully, you can get that more out of your top side, because I don't think mid is going to be offering it. And then bot lane, really intriguing. Now, this is the most volatile part of this team, in my opinion, by a large margin, because you're bringing in Dectum to play AD carry, and the only returning member of this team is Beryl in the support position. I'm actually going to talk about Beryl first here, because a lot of people are going to look at that number 4 ranking for support, and they're going to freak out. I mean, he was just fantastic at the World Championships. This is somebody who has now won 2 different Worlds with 2 different teams, one of the best supports of all time. How can I rank him as low as 4th? And to that I say, did you watch the LCK last year? Because he was problematic for this DRX team. You have to remember, DRX very narrowly made the World Championship. This was a team that went 500, below 500 if you look at game score in the regular season. They went 22 and 23. They were able to make that run in the gauntlet from being the 6th seed to make playoffs. But a big reason why this team struggled in the regular season was because Beryl was bad. Like, there was really no other way to put it. He was one of the worst supports in the league for most of the regular season for DRX. DRX. Now, yes, he turned it around when the games mattered the most, but it's definitely still a little bit concerning to have an entire year's worth of tape on Beryl and not really see anything fantastic. I think putting him at 4th is probably somewhere in the middle of where he played in the regular season and where he played at Worlds. He could be the #1 support in the region, and it really wouldn't surprise me all that much. But if he plays like he did in 2022's regular season, he's definitely closer to 4th than he is to #1, and so I am meeting somewhere in the middle. He is in this upper echelon of a lot of supports. There are a lot of really good supports in the LCK, so it's really hard for me to, sit here and say that he's definitely, not top 2. He definitely could be top 2, but it's just really hard to put him above any of the players I have him listed below. And then, of course, at AD Carry, you're bringing in Dekdom. Played for Damwon last year. A lot of people saw him as kind of the weak link, quote-unquote, of Damwon last year. I don't agree with that. I think that he was actually relatively consistent in the role that he was given, which is this late-game carry team fighter. His Aphelios is nuts. He's the #1 AD carry in the region on Aphelios, but obviously, he's not going to be allowed to get that every game. When he's on other champions, he still likes to play that style of playing a little bit more passive in the early game, likes to poke at early levels, and then really shift back into a more defensive position so he can carry from the late game. I just think he does it slightly more efficiently than someone like Aiming does, which is why he comes in one spot above a player like Aiming. I do like Dekdom as kind of this stable piece in the bot lane. If you're going to have players like Rascal and Krako that are going to be trying to generate a ton of leads on the top side, having a bot laner like Dekdom that is happy to not get resources and is happy to just play really safe, I think is super positive for DRX. And, pair that up with Beryl, who really does like to leave lane. He likes to play for those map advantages, likes to play with his jungler. I think having a player like Dekdom, who is just perfectly content with farming under tower for most of the game in the bot lane, is positive, which is why I think he is a good addition to this DRX team with how they are presently constructed. And so where do I think this team lands overall? I think they're solid. I think the top side I actually really like. I really like Rascal and Krako as a duo. I think if they can get on the same page, this team could definitely be a top 4, Worlds caliber team. It's just, there are a lot of question marks outside of that. You need to get Worlds Beryl all year long, because if you get the Beryl that you got for the regular season in 2022, that's not a good sign. Fate really needs to step up. He didn't really show me a lot last year, and he's never really been someone that I've been ridiculously high on, so I need to see a better version of him moving into 2023. Dekdom's not really this big, power piece on the map like some of the other top teams have, and so they do have some question marks, but obviously this organization has defied the odds before, and I would be lying if I said they definitely did not have the talent to be a top 4 team. It's just about putting it together and really showing that DRX as an org can push forward even if the players from last year still aren't there. Now we're moving into the top 4 teams here in my power rankings in the LCK. Of course, as you all know, Worlds accommodates 4 teams, but this is Spring Split. We're not worried about Worlds yet. That's a really, really long time away for a lot of these teams, and so you're really going to be looking to try and get top 2 this split so you can make MSI. So these are the teams that I think, obviously it started with DRX, but these are really the teams that I think are in that position to push for an MSI spot. And top of the A tier coming in here, just below that top 3 that I think all really have a case to be the #1 team in the league. Coming in at number 4, we have Hanwha Life Esports. What a turnaround for this organization in the offseason. Some people are going to look at this as too low for Hanwha Life. I know some people are going to put this team at number 1, but I'll kind of go through and explain why I'm maybe a little bit more apprehensive about this team than maybe putting them at number 1. I still think they're very good. Remember, top 4 in the LCK is a very good team. 4th place in the LCK did just win Worlds after all. So their 2023 roster is looking like Kingen in the top lane, Klid in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Viper at AD carry, and Life at support. Like pretty much every facet of this roster, but they do have a few question marks, which is the reason they come into the A tier and not into the S tier. So let's talk about it. It's going to start on the top side, where I really praise DRX's top side. I think the top side for Hanwha Life is really where you can start to look at maybe some question marks, and that kicks off with Kingen here in the top lane. And I know a lot of people are going to be saying, how can you rank Kingen so low at number 5 for top laners in his own region when he just won World Finals MVP? And I understand that he had a pretty good tournament. He wasn't necessarily the carry for this team, but he definitely outplayed a lot of his opponents, most notably Doran in that semifinals matchup against Gen G, where he really did look good. And then obviously he had a really good series against Zeus when it mattered the most in World Finals. But I've said this in previous videos in the past. I talked about this, for both pros and cons for some players, but Worlds is not always a great indicator for how a player will perform over the course of an entire season. And that has proven itself to be true many, many times in the past year, not only in the LCK, but in the LPL, and even at a smaller scale in like the LCS and the LEC, where if a player performs really well at Worlds, that doesn't mean that they're just a great player and that they're automatically going to play that well all of next year if they never showed it before that. And alternatively, if a player plays bad at Worlds, it's not necessarily a sign that they are trash and they don't deserve to be taken as seriously as maybe their regular season performance would show. In Kingan's case, I think he's probably a little bit worse than what his World performance has shown. He had a breakout year in 2022, in my opinion, the best year of his career in the LCK. Really, ever since coming over to the LCK, he's been a little bit of a hindrance for that DRX team. He definitely was in 2021, but 2022, a little bit more of a breakout year. Spring wasn't all that great for him. Summer definitely was. I had him in my all-pro team, but that's mostly because top was definitely a little bit weaker. Coming in around 5th in the top lane, I don't think is really all that bad. I think there were a lot of really good top laners in the region, and just unfortunately, Kingan kind of falls below some of them just for the consistency reasons. He's at his best when he gets to play a little bit strong side, but I really don't think that is going to happen with this Hanwha Life team, so I think he's going to come in as a weak side top laner that can make some noise, but isn't necessarily going to be like the most impactful top laner in the region. You pair that up with a jungler in Clid, who is coming off of an up and down season to say the least. I am much higher on Clid's 2022 with FPX than I think a lot of other people are. I think he showed a lot more on tape than a lot of people like to give him credit for. A lot of people are just going to drag his 2022 on FPX as like a down year because that team underperformed, but I think there were definitely pockets of the season where he was the best player on that team by a considerable margin, especially before Summit joined as the top laner. I think Clid was definitely kind of carrying the weight of that FPX team to come back over here to Hanwha Life. I think he definitely has better teammates around him now than he did last year in the LPL. I think he could definitely be primed for a bounce-back season, but it is worth noting that, like I talked about with a lot of the KT roster, bounce-back season does not mean that I'm definitely just going to rank him super high. I definitely think he is in a good position to be able to show the talent level that he has had before he left for the LPL, but he does need to show it before I fully commit to putting him back in like that top 3, top 4 jungle in the region kind of ranking. I put him just below a player like Krako, because I do think he has a bit more to prove than players like Krako, and of course the top 3 junglers in the LCK are all ridiculous, and so he's probably not going to be cracking that list unless he has a fantastic year, but you look at the duo of Kingan and Clid, and while they are strong, it might not be as strong as some of the other players on this roster lead you to believe. That's really where I think Hanwha Life, quote-unquote, falters on paper is, I think the other teams kind of above them in that S tier, as I'll call it, don't necessarily have the same kind of question marks on any part of the map as Hanwha does on the top side here for me with Kingan and Clid. Where you start to get to no question marks, in my opinion, is the rest of this roster. The bottom 3 are all fantastic, and of course that's going to start with Zeka. I've been tooting Zeka's horn for probably like a year, 2 years now, very, very heavily. I was talking all throughout the LCK season last year about how he was the most underrated player in the world, and then he had his Worlds run, where I think everybody now knows who he is, and now me putting him at 4th is probably going to look like heresy because he had such a fantastic Worlds run. It's just very difficult to get top 3 in the mid lane position in the LCK. It's hard for me to justify putting someone who had one fantastic year, and yes, he did have a fantastic year. He had a better year than at least one of the players that's in the top 3, but it's hard for me to justify putting him ahead of Faker, or putting him ahead of Showmaker, or Chovy, just after 1 year. I think if he does it again, he's really going to break into that conversation, but getting 4th in the mid lane rankings in the LCK is certainly not a slight on how good Zeka is. I think you can make a case that he is probably the hottest player, with the most momentum coming into this Hanwha Life team, and he could be a carry presence if he pairs up with Clid nearly as well as he paired up with any jungler that he had on DRX. He's going to be fantastic and a really big power point for this team this year. They're going to be super happy to be able to bring him in. He is the breakout star of 2022 globally, in my opinion. And then you have Viper coming in at AD carry. How is that fair? Zeka Viper as like your carry role duo is absolutely nuts. I have Viper as the #1 AD carry in the LCK, kind of replacing Ruler. They kind of flip-flopped. Ruler goes on to be my #1 AD carry in the LPL. Viper goes on to become my #1 AD carry in the LCK because they both were the other last year, in my opinion. Ever since EDG realized that playing through Viper is like a way to win games, Viper has been one of the top 2 AD carries in the world with Ruler, in my opinion. He just carries games like no other. He's ridiculously consistent. He's super aggressive in laning phase. He's going to try and punish any little mistake that you make, and if he does get a lead, it is basically over because his positioning is near perfect. This team wasn't able to take down DRX at Worlds, the EDG team that is, but it certainly wasn't due to Viper. He was by far the best player on EDG in that best of 5, especially in those first 2 games where he was looking phenomenal when EDG took a 2-0 series lead. So for me, Viper, Zeka as a carry lane duo, absolutely fantastic. And those 2 players are doing the brunt of the heavy lifting to get Hanwha Life into this top 4, in my opinion. You're very rarely going to find a team with that level of talent on it that isn't in the top 4, but that's again just because topside isn't super consistent. And then you have Life at support. I think Life is a very good player. He comes in at number 5 in my rankings, but again, that's just because the top tier of LCK supports are all really, really good. He comes in just behind Barrel. I don't think that is a super controversial take to have, that he's just a little bit behind like that upper echelon, but he was fantastic last year. He made aiming look like $1 million. Obviously, credit to aiming. He did his job well, but Life was basically the perfect support to bring that out of him, and I think he's going to have a similar kind of experience here with Viper, except Viper is just better. Life is going to be able to play early aggression in these lanes. He's always been relatively good at that kind of. It's not his focal point. I think his focal point is definitely team fighting late in games, but he can play that early aggression. He can roam with his jungler, although I don't think that's going to be a huge style for this Hanwha Life team because I do feel like they're going to play a lot through bot lane, so that early aggression is definitely going to be more of a focal point, I think, for Life in his game plan. But like I said, he's really known for his team fights, whether that's on Engagers or on Enchanters, sitting in the backline, making sure that his AD carry is in a perfect position to be able to win these team fights. I think that is exactly what this team needs. He's going to make like $1 million, and I'm really not all that concerned about whether or not Hanwha Life is going to succeed through that bot lane. Really, the only concern for me is whether or not this top lane and this top side with Kingen and Klid can hold up at a world caliber level for an entire year. Klid has obviously done it before. Kingen has done it before. They just need to prove that they can do it consistently, because that's really the only question mark that this team has. They are fantastic, and I really do think that if everything clicks for this team, if Kingen's great on weak side, if Klid gets back to Genji Klid, Zeka, Viper, Life, all hit, this could be a team that wins the LCK as recent as Spring Split. They really do have that kind of talent. It's just hard for me to predict that when you have at least a little bit of inconsistency, slightly more than the top 3 in my opinion. Now we're really getting into the nitty-gritty as we get into the top 3 teams in my LCK power rankings. Want to make a preface here that all 3 of these teams are fantastic. That's why they are all in the S tier for me. They are all really, really, really solid, and I think all of them could win Worlds. Like, really, once you get to the S tier of any of these major regions, like, all of them realistically could win MSI, could win Worlds, could win a major international tournament, could be the best team in the world if everything goes right. It's just all about the probability, in my eyes, of those things going right. So, for me, coming in at the bottom of that S tier in the top 3, and coming in at 3rd in my power rankings, it is going to be Gen G. Now, I've seen a lot of people place them lower in these power rankings that they've been doing in the preseason because they did make some changes, and they're going to have to play a different style than they did last year, but I really have faith in these players and in this organization to be able to make it work, at least to the point where they can be a very competitive team towards the top of the standings. So their roster in 2023 is looking like Doran in the top lane, Peanut in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Pez at AD carry, and Delight at support. Very intriguing roster. I want to get this out of the way now, first and foremost, because I'm sure in the 30 or so seconds that I've been talking about Gen G, and their graphic has been up on the screen, that somebody has already typed a ridiculously angry comment about how Peanut is listed as the #1 jungler in the LCK in my player rankings. So I'm actually going to talk about him first here because I just want to get this out of the way. First and foremost, I know Peanut and Canyon are both very good players. They are very different players. I don't really think it's super fair to compare the two as junglers. If you want to sit here and say Peanut's a fraud, I don't agree with that, but I also understand why you would say that because he doesn't generate the same kind of leads for himself that a player like Canyon does or a player like Kanavi does in the LPL. If you want to say Peanut's the best jungler in the world, it's really hard for me to criticize that too, because I think you can make a real case that there is no jungler in the world that makes his teammates look better than a player like Peanut. All I ask down in the comment section below is that if you have a disagreement, talk about it respectfully. Don't call me a moron for putting Peanut at number 1. Don't say that I'm delusional. Peanut was the best jungler in the regular season last year for the LCK. Yes, he had his hiccups at Worlds, but he still had a pretty good World Championship. He was fantastic in group stage. He just had a couple of bad games there in the knockout stage overall. So for me, you know what, you want to compare Peanut and Canyon or whatever, even Owner, you know, make that argument, but it's just really hard to compare a more supportive style jungler like Peanut to a carry style jungler like Canyon, because they both do what they do so ridiculously efficiently. If you wanted Canyon at number 1, I'm certainly not going to give you pushback. If you wanted Owner at number 1, I might give you a little bit more. But the difference between Peanut and Canyon in terms of the impact they have on the game is really not all that big. You want Peanut at 2, great. You want Peanut at 1, great. It doesn't really matter to me. I just know I'm going to get a lot of pushback for it, so I figure I should jump ahead of that in this video. But let's go ahead and talk about Peanut as a player. He's the best supportive jungler in the world. He's the best facilitating jungler that the world has. He does not need resources. He will consistently win you early game. He will consistently make sure that you have pressure in your lanes. He will put everything aside to make sure that whatever lane or lanes that he chooses wins the game. He does it better than anybody else in the world. His late game team fighting can be a little bit suspect, but honestly, that was an aspect that took a downturn last year. If he can get back to where he was, I remember when he was on LGD and that team made a Worlds run, I believe, in 2021. He was a fantastic team fighter, and it was a big reason why they were able to close out games, was because he was doing a really good job of being able to control the pace of the game overall. Even on Nongshim the year before, he was doing a really good job of making sure that the pace of the game was controlled. Really, the only knock that you can have on Peanut as a player is that sometimes he's not pushing his advantage nearly enough, but I would argue that he is, just in different ways. Maybe not the traditional jungle way. He's not going to go and invade ridiculously. He's going to create a ton of pressure on the map by trying to take objectives, by trying to make sure that every single lane has push advantage, and by trying to force team fights in the mid game. It's what Gen G did better than any other team in the world last year, and it was forcing team fights in the mid game to make sure that they had gold leads going into the back half. This team basically, over the course of the regular season and over the course of LCK playoffs even, never had to go into a late game at a disadvantage, because they were so adept at getting advantages in the early game that they never even really had to think about playing from behind. A lot of that I attribute to Peanut. He was in my top 3 for MVP voting last year, even though his teammate won it. He was number 3 in my MVP voting. He was that good, in my opinion, and he was the best jungler in the LCK over the course of the year, so he comes in at number 1. Then you also have Doran here in the top lane. Now, I've been historically a little bit lower on Doran, but I still think he's a ridiculously talented player, and I actually think he might be in the market for a little bit of a breakout season this year. Quote-unquote breakout, because he was really good last year, but he might get a lot more resources on this Gen G team than he did last year. Last year, he was a little bit more of that, you know, weak link, quote-unquote, player. Not that he was a weak link, but the one that had to, you know, lose a bit of resources to make sure everybody else could feel accommodated. Chovy was getting those resources. Ruler was getting those resources. You take Ruler out of the equation, you introduce a rookie like Pez, who, yes, you are going to want to give him resources, but it might not be in the way that you gave Ruler those same kinds of resources, just because we'll get to that bot lane in a bit. Doran might be the one to get a little bit more of that pressure, a little bit more of that jungle attention from Peanut, who really does like to pick a couple of lanes and really make sure that they are pushing forward. Doran might be that guy this year. He was at points last year, but I think this year might be a little bit more efficient for him. So he actually comes in at number 3. Realistically, I can see him falling as low as number 5. I think that's kind of around where he was last year, around number 3, 4, or 5. You know, if you want to compare him to Kingen or whatever, that's fine. I think Kingen was better last year. I would expect Doran to be better this year. That's kind of where I'm going into the season at. So he falls in at number 3. Top lane's not really this dominant role. He's not someone who's going to be, like, taking over the game, at least in the LCK. I don't think it's the kind of role where they have the talent depth. I don't think really any team in the world has the talent depth right now at top lane, but Doran is really, really solid, and I would expect him to be a major positive for this team overall, maybe even more so than he was last year. Of course, you've got Chovy in the mid lane. What else can I say about Chovy? I mean, come on, it's Chovy. You can make a real case that he is the single best player in the world. What really impressed me about Chovy last year is, obviously, we know he can be a carry player. We know that with resources, he's going to win you games. He's going to win you late game team fights. He's going to be a mid-game monster. That's really where he dominates. But really, what he did fantastic last year was pair up with Peanut and make a lot of these macro plays around 10 to 11 minutes to be able to enable a lot of the rest of that team. A lot of times last year it was around Rift Herald. Sometimes they would do it around Dragon if they wanted to get Ruler involved as well, but they would often transition a lot of that team up to topside to make sure that they could pretty consistently be able to take those objectives. If they're able to play that game plan again this year, Chovy is going to continue to look like one of the best players in the world. It's weird because he took a quote-unquote backseat role, but in that backseat role, it honestly impressed me more, kind of show me how good Chovy is as a player, just generally speaking. You can usually teach a player to play carry. It's very difficult to teach a player to play for the team, and Chovy really showed that he could do that last year. A lot of the criticism that he's not a team player, I think, should have vanished after 2022. Really, the only question mark that this Gen G team has is going to be in this bot lane. Pez and Delight really are not proven at all. I'm actually pretty high on Pez. Watched a lot of his tape in Challengers Korea last year, and he was really, really good, really mechanically talented. You put him in a team that has a very vocal voice and a very good playmaker in Peanut, and I actually think he's going to integrate relatively seamlessly into this team. I think he's probably going to have the most impactful year of any rookie coming into the LCK this year. Obviously, he's the odds-on favorite for Rookie of the Year, and I certainly don't disagree with that. I think he is a fantastic mechanical player that really just needs that team around him to be able to acclimate him to the LCK, and I think he has it. If you have any questions about this bot lane, it's probably going to come from Delight, and that's interesting because Delight's, he has LCK experience. He's played for quite a bit on Brionne, but he's never really looked all that good. Henna and Delight have consistently been a bottom 2 bot lane in the LCK for quite some time. I would say the 2 years that they've played together, they've never really been anything other than a bottom 2 bot lane in the region. And so for Delight to come back here to Gen G, an organization that has obviously trained him up before, he's really going to have to show something that he has not shown at an LCK level before. I think you can make a real case that Henna was the better version of those two in Henna and Delight in that bot lane. And so he really is going to need to do his best to not be a weak link. If he is, that could actually, impact Pez at least a little bit in his terms of being able to lane early on in games. I trust Peanut to be able to help him out as much as he can, but if Delight is a straight hindrance to this team, we've seen what can happen when your support is just kind of running it. That's a position where if you are the worst player on the team, it makes the team worse actively. Your support really needs to be at least competent for you to be a top team in the league, and that is definitely a concern for Gen G, and honestly, in my opinion, Delight is by far the biggest reason this team comes in third instead of higher than anything else. If Delight is closer to a top 5-ish support, which I think is probably looking at it optimistically, this team could be, the best team in the world. They absolutely could, but a part of me just tells me that Delight is going to hold this team back quite a bit, and they might even have to make a change mid-year to try and salvage their season if they do want to get the most out of this jungle mid duo, which is one of, if not the best in the world going into 2023. And so definitely some question marks about the team, but the talent here is absolutely ludicrous. When you have Peanut, when you have Chovy, when you have Doran even, this team is going to be really solid. If you can get Pez to kind of seamlessly adapt and get those mechanics out in the LCK, that's a huge plus. If you get really anything out of Delight, that's probably also going to be a huge plus. So looking at Gen G as probably the weakest of these S-tier teams, but with the core and the nucleus of this team being Peanut and Chovy, it's really hard for me to rank them anything lower than S-tier. That's going to bring us to our top 2. These are the 2 teams that I am predicting to go to MSI from the LCK at the beginning here of the spring split in 2023. Now, obviously, you know who those 2 teams are because you can cross them off the list. The only 2 teams I haven't talked about yet. Obviously, revealing number 2 is also going to reveal my number 1, but we will save that for when we talk about it. So, who's number 2? Who's coming in as the runner-up here in the LCK in my pre-season power rankings? Well, number 2 in my power rankings is D+ Kia. The rebrand, the rename, Damwon moving to D+. I'm glad they already graded themselves on the rebrand. I'll talk about this really quick. It's ugly, it's bad, it's gross. Anyways, moving on to the team. Obviously, I really like what they were able to do, what they were able to put together on this roster in the offseason. They lost some pieces, but I think you could argue that they upgraded in almost every aspect, and they certainly made themselves, I think, a little bit more consistent. So let's go ahead and talk about what they're looking like. In the top lane, you've got Kana. In the jungle, you've got Canyon. Mid lane is Showmaker. AD carry is Deft, and support is Kellen. Really like this team. Really, really like it. Let's talk about Kana first. One of the new additions to the team. He's going to be replacing Nuguri and Bertle, I guess, to an extent, who did play in the playoffs quite a bit. I think Kana is actually a pretty intriguing addition to this team. Obviously, did not have the best of 2022s. Nobody on that Nongshim Red Force had the best of 2022s. He's going to kind of join a list of players that is really looking for a bounce back after that team just fell apart, completely fell apart last year. Kana definitely a part of that. Certainly didn't have a great year, but this is a player we've seen be a really consistent presence in the past as both a carry and a weak side player. I actually think he is a really intriguing mix of Bertle and Nuguri's playstyles, where Nuguri was someone who I think kind of as the year went on adapted to this more like secondary carry playing style, someone who really wasn't getting a lot of resources when he was in the game, whereas Bertle I think was kind of getting some resources, maybe not nearly as much as he would want, like I talked about in the sandbox portion, but still kind of an interesting dichotomy to have with those two top laners. I think Kana's somewhere in the middle. Kana actually plays weak side in my opinion better than either of those players do, and I think that could be a pretty huge plus for a team that has always, and I mean always, just wanted to play through jungle and mid. That is just always going to be how Damwon wants to play the game, and I think Kana maybe fits into this Damwon or D+ team, I should say. If I call them Damwon, I'm sorry. It's a hard transition for me. I think he maybe fits into this D+ team a little bit better than maybe some other people might be giving them credit for. I think Kana is going to come in and be a little bit of a seamless quote-unquote replacement for Nuguri, who really wasn't all that good last year. I think he's going to come in and be potentially a little bit more consistent for this team, even if he's not more talented as a player than someone like Nuguri. But then you get into, obviously, the main two. They've been here. They're going to be here forever. Obviously, there was some talk in the offseason that they might be switching teams, that at least one of them might be leaving, but nope. They're able to retain both of them. Canyon and Showmaker are back as the jungle mid duo, the greatest jungle mid duo of all time, returning here to Damwon. I have them both ranked number 2. They both could be number 1 in their roles. Showmaker is fantastic. Obviously, he's just right below Chovy, in my opinion. I think Chovy has established himself as the number 1 mid laner in the LCK, but it's not like Showmaker is some kind of slouch. People will talk about the quote-unquote down year that he had last year, and I do kind of agree that he was a little bit of a down year in the regular season, but he really did step it up when it mattered the most. He was really good in that regional gauntlet series against Live Sandbox, and he had a really good world championship as well, even though this team wasn't able to accomplish the goals that they really wanted to. They ran into a ridiculously tough Gen G team in that quarterfinal, and unfortunately they weren't able to advance. But then you get to talk about Canyon. Now, Canyon's an interesting argument. Like I said in the Gen G segment, if you wanted to put Canyon at number 1, I'm not going to blame you, really, at all. But one thing I do want to say, obviously Canyon had a fantastic world championship. He was phenomenal in the group stage, and he really almost like just single-handedly carried Damwon across the finish line in that quarterfinal series against Gen G, where he did outplay Peanut. But let's not just forget that going into the World Championship and going into playoffs specifically, go look at my comment section on my playoff preview video. People are like, oh, Canyon's washed. He's had an awful year, and I'm having to sit there and stand up for Canyon. I'm the one who has to sit there and be like, no, actually, Canyon deserves All-Pro nominations. He was the best player on this Damwon team when they would win games. It was because of him. Public sentiment was super against this player for a majority of last year, especially in the summer. And then obviously he turned it around. It kind of just shows you the power of narratives of moving into playoffs. You're not going to convince a lot of fans that Canyon was a top 2 jungler in the region, but coming out of Worlds, and it's pretty criminal to not put him at number 1. I'm going to fit somewhere in the middle. It's kind of really where I've always been in terms of situations like this. I try not to overreact to, one bit of information. You got to take in the full picture in order to really get an idea of where a player lies. I do think he is definitely going to cost his team some moments, but for the most part, he is going to be a driving force that leads you to be one of the best teams in the world. He comes in at number 2. He's maybe not as consistent as a player like Peanut is, but he definitely has higher highs. So like I said, if you wanted to put him at number 1, I'm not going to complain. I just, I don't want to completely forget about some of the mishaps that he had in the regular season last year. Him and Showmaker are still one of, if not the best jungle mid duo in the world. I have them just below Peanut and Chovy on Gen G, but still a very, very solid duo that is going to be a centerpiece for carrying this team to being one of the best teams in the world. And then you have a new look bot lane. Kellen returns here at support, and man, does he get a bad rap, and I just don't really understand why. I understand that Canyon and Showmaker are like the faces of this franchise, and so quote-unquote everybody else must be getting carried, and that's a prevailing thought that has kind of lingered in the league community forever, that if one player is good, that means the other player is getting carried. But I don't know how you can watch film of Damwon last year and not see Kellen as like a really, really good support, one of the best in the world, which he just is. He was fantastic for this team. Him and Dectum were ridiculously consistent, especially towards the late game, but Kellen did a really good job of knowing when he needed to play for his advantages. He knew he wasn't going to be on strong side of the map all that much as the bot lane, here for Damwon, especially with Nuguri coming back in. He knew that wasn't going to be a power point, so he knew when he could play aggressive. He knew when he needed to leave lane and start to roam, and he knew when he needed to play for his bot lane 2v2. He has a really good understanding of the game, and this is a player that, in my opinion, has really shown everything that you want to see out of a top-level support in any region in the world. So I don't really understand why I see people placing him as like the 6th best support in the LCK. I think he has clearly shown that he is a top 3 to 5 support in the world. And I have him rated as such. He's coming in at number 3 for me. He is really, really, really good, and I think he's going to get another chance to prove that this year. He's pairing up with Deft, who I think is basically the perfect addition for this team. One thing I criticized Deft for a lot of last year was that I think a lot of people were looking at him as this super carry for DRX in the regular season when things weren't working out. I don't think that has really ever been Deft's playstyle, especially over the back end of his career here. He is a super stable bot laner that is really going to excel at going even in matchups where he shouldn't go even. He's great at these champions that can play really safe. Obviously, the Ezreal comes to mind, but give him something like the Caitlyn. He's going to be able to push that lane without really a ton of threat from the enemy side of really being able to counter it, and you can devote your resources elsewhere. That's what Deft does super well, is he allows his team to be able to devote their resources somewhere other than bot when they know that he's going to be consistently in that lane. He's not someone who's going to absolutely destroy a 2v2 in bot lane by himself. He really isn't that kind of player anymore. He wasn't that last year for DRX. What he is this incredibly stable presence that is going to allow your team the flexibility of doing pretty much anything else they want on the map. And so Deft fitting in here with a super strong jungle mid that really like to work together with Canyon and Showmaker. Perhaps you want to invest more into that top side. With Kana, I think Deft really is the perfect player to fill into that role. And that's why I think this D plus Kia team really is going to click over the course of 2023. I have them coming in second, if only for the fact that Kana definitely still has stuff to prove. I think if he gets back to his T1 form, obviously this team is going to be an absolute menace. But outside of that, when you're getting to the top 2 teams in the LCK, it's really hard to look at reasons why they're not one of the best teams in the world. I think, you know, the team that comes in at number 1, which obviously you guys already know because there's only one team left, I think they're just a tad bit more consistent, if not for the fact that they've just played together for longer. I think if D Plus came in as the number 1 team in the LCK by the end of the year, I wouldn't be entirely surprised. But for that, you're going to need to get the best version of Showmaker. You're going to need to get the best version of Canyon, and then I think the rest of this team will unlock. But really, from a talent standpoint, there are very, very, very few teams in the world that have anything on this D plus Kia team. That's going to bring us to our final team in this video. Of course, the number 1 team in my power rankings, and if you've been keeping track, you know who's at number 1, and it really should not be a surprise to a lot of people who I have at number 1 in my power rankings at the start of 2023, and it is T1. They continue to run it back. This roster that has been so successful over the past year, and really, I mean, for the most part, over the past 2 years, they have really kind of grown and learned together, is being run back here again for 2023. It is looking like Zeus in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Keria at support. I mean, what can I say? This is a team that just made World Finals, and they're bringing back all 5 members, and you can make a real case that all 5 are some of the best players in their roles in the entire world. It was a really easy decision, in my opinion, to have T1 at the top of the power rankings, at least to start the year. I would expect this team to really start the year on a fast footing. So let's go ahead and talk about each individual player because we can. Let's start with Zeus. In the top lane, I have made it no secret that I am a huge Zeus fan. He comes in at number 1 in my LCK top lane power rankings, and he comes in at number 1 in my world top laner power rankings. I do think that Zeus, in my opinion, is the best top laner in the world, and I do think it's close. But maybe not with how 369 is playing right now. If that gap continues to grow a little bit bigger, maybe Zeus will be just by far, you know, no debate, the best top lane in the world. He looked like it last year. He definitely looked like it over the course of the year, and then kind of proved it at Worlds. He is just ridiculous. He is so good at every facet of top lane. He is great at these carry champions. He can really take over games on things like the Jace that have been his classic pick. You know, obviously Camille, Fiora, he knows how to play all of them. The Jax, they're all scary for Zeus to be able to pick up. But what really separates Zeus is that he's not just some carry top lane player. You want to put him on Ornn, you want to put him on Cassante, weak side, he's going to absolutely thrive in that environment. He's going to be fantastic in that role, and I think that's really what separates Zeus from a lot of his other contemporaries, is he does every part of top lane well. He can carry the lane, he can play weak side, he can win the 1v1s, he can take resources, he can play a more roaming style. Whatever you need from Zeus, he is going to be able to do it, and he's going to be able to do it better than almost any top laner in the entire world. It is a ridiculous asset to have a player like him on your team in T1. It's crazy just how much talent comes through that system. They're able to cultivate him. They're able to cultivate a player like Owner in the jungle who also comes through the T1 system. He continues to look like one of the best junglers in the world. He comes in at number 3 for me. I do think he's like a half step down from players like Peanut and Canyon. He's still really freaking good, and he's one of the top 5 junglers in the world, but just a little bit of a half step down coming in at number 3. A really, really solid player that sometimes can get a little bit over aggressive. I've noticed that sometimes in the regular season, I'm not sure if he just gets overconfident or if perhaps sometimes he just takes games a little bit not seriously enough against some of the bottom teams, but he can get into positions that definitely require his team to bail him out that maybe some of the other top players don't necessarily do nearly as consistently, but his mechanical prowess and his ability to control the game and his timing and his pacing, whether that's on the call of someone like Faker or Keria, or if it's just his natural timing, whatever it ends up being, the way he functions on this team and the way he's able to control the game is better than almost any jungler in the entire world, and he is a huge asset for this team to have. Like I said, another player that has come through the T1 youth system. You have Faker in the mid lane. What can I say about Faker? Some people are going to want to put him lower than 3rd. I know I've been a little bit lower on Faker on this channel, but for me, he's still a top 5, 6-ish mid laner in the world. I had him that in my player rankings last year. Just a ridiculously consistent player. He's really morphed into more of a supportive style mid, someone who is good on those shove and roam champions, but as we saw at the World Championship, he can bring out the Akali, and he can still do a ton of damage. I just think for the most part, this team is constructed in a way where you want to give a lot of resources to Owner, you want to give a lot of resources to Gumayushi, and you want to give a lot of resources to Zeus, so Faker's kind of the one that has to take a little bit of a concession when it comes to those resources, but he might be the best supportive mid lane player in the world. The way that he plays the Galio, the way that he plays the Lissandra, it's right up there with Xiaohu, in my opinion, for that best, like, supportive mid, and Yagao. I can't forget to include Yagao for, like, the best supportive mid lane player in the world and how he ends up functioning in the game. I really, really like Faker. I know it hasn't come across like that on the channel all the time, but that top side is ridiculous. And then I've always been much higher on this bot lane than I think a lot of other people were, especially over the course of last year. People were really starting to trash Guma and Keria because they weren't performing up to expectation, and by that, they were only a top 3 or 4 bot lane in the league and not a top 1 bot lane in the league, but at Worlds, they really proved their worth. I think for the most part, that's probably closer to their actual talent level. I think Guma was underrated for a majority of the year. Yes, he made positioning mistakes, but as I always talk about on this channel, I would much rather have an AD carry who is trying to win the game than an AD carry who is trying not to lose the game at a pro level, and I think Guma is an AD carry that will try to win you the game, and I think for the most part, it works for T1. He was fantastic in the Worlds run, but even over the course of the regular season, I honestly think that his performance was a little bit undervalued, even if it wasn't necessarily perfect at all times. And then I've always been ridiculously high on Keria. I still think he's one of, if not the best support in the world. He is just ridiculous when it comes to consistency. He's ridiculous on engagers. He's ridiculous on enchanters. He was a big reason why that team was able to make that Worlds run last year that people weren't talking about. Keria just proves again, time after time after time, that he is a premier support and he can do it at pretty much any level. Guma and Keria should be one of, if not the best bot lane in the region, and it really shouldn't be all that close if they can live up to expectations. You're hoping that they can hit that like 1-2 bot lane range. Obviously, if they don't, it's not going to absolutely kill this team. They do have talent elsewhere, but they have the talent and they really should be able to live up to that. So that's why T1 comes in at number 1 for me. They're running back the same 5. There's really not a lot to talk about when it comes to why I think this way. I don't really think this is going to be that shocking. As long as everybody on this team plays up to the level that we know that they can play at, like they played at not only last year, but throughout Worlds as well, this team should be the number 1 team, and in my opinion, the team that is hoisting the LCK trophy at the end of the spring split. All right, that is going to do it for my LCK 2023 Spring Split Power Rankings video. Let me know down in the comment section below whether you guys enjoyed the video or not. What do you agree with? What do you not agree with? I know I'm going for a little bit more, I don't want to say controversial opinions this year, but certainly planting my flag a bit more than I have in previous years on some players and on some teams, and I know that you guys are going to disagree with it. Your list is definitely not going to be the exact same as mine, so let me know what yours is down in the comment section below. Of course, do it respectfully. I'm always happy to have conversations like that. You guys killed it on the LPL video with your predictions and your expectations, and I love hearing you guys' thoughts and feedback. What am I high on? What am I low on in your opinion? Of course, if you did enjoy the video, go ahead and hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to the channel. And if you are new here and you got through this hour-and-a-half long video of me talking about the LCK, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I've got an LPL video that you should check out, and I'm going to be having LCS and LEC videos coming out soon as well. So if you're interested in that kind of content, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We're going to be jumping right back into it, not only with preseason analysis content, but with weekly review content, which we've already started, of course, over in the LPL. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. With all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.